Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Go to shiftingculturepodcast.com to interact or donate. In this episode, we have a conversation with Roy Moran. Roy is the founder of Shoal Community Church, the author of Spent Matches, and the chairman of the board at New Generations. In this episode, we discuss disciple-making movements and the mind shifts and heart changes that DMM brings about in the culture of our lives and the lives that we impact. I know you're going to enjoy this episode. Roy has a lot of incredible things to say. So sit back, relax, enjoy, and here's the conversation. Roy Moran, welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast. Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Joshua. I appreciate you having me, man. I'm excited about this whole podcast thing you're doing.
Yeah, it's been really fun. I've had really good conversations with some people now. I've really enjoyed it. So it's helping people go a little bit deeper than surface level, especially in the relationship with Jesus.
So how did you come up with the name?
I've always been fascinated with a transfer of culture towards more kingdom culture of what it looks like. And so I wanted to figure out what's one step that we can do to make sure that cultures can transform from within. So when Meredith and I went to the Middle East, our mission statement of what we wanted to do was we dreamed that within our lifetime, movements of Muslims following Jesus would sweep across the Arab world and transform it from within. And so one of the things that I've always said is that we wanted to help local people take what they have learned and their culture and go deep, especially into the roots and the worldview level, and help a long-lasting transformation from within. So been fascinating with that for a long time. And then, so shifting culture is what I landed on.
Well, that's cool. I love that idea because one of the things that hit me when I heard the title was, I think for the first 5 years I was involved in the whole disciple making movements tactic. I really began to, I first thought it was just a training issue. It's just about, I could just take into a local church. I could just retrain people. They've been trained how to share their faith. Now they need to change, just change their way they do things and learn how to just share their story, invite people into discovery, read the Bible together. People would come to faith through that. And I realized it was really not about training. It was about culture. You literally, if you're in an organization that's attempting to move from a different strategy, say an addition type strategy to a multiplication type strategy, it's literally a cultural issue, not a training issue. So I love your title.
Yeah, thanks. And I think, when long time ago, just as my dad wrote a book called about biblical worldview integration. He started a Christian school, and so he talked a lot about worldview and talked about how your worldview affects your value system, and your values affect the behavior, and all those behaviors then affect the culture around. And so you had to go back to the root system, what's underneath, to be able to change the fruit of what you see around you. And so that's good. Have you seen that happen? Have you seen a culture shift happen to a culture of disciple making and that revolves around Jesus, anywhere around the world? And how did they get there?
Yeah, I think in the world of movements that I get a chance to be involved in, say like in East Africa, I think there's a definite shift taking place. Does it move the needle on terms of lostness and that kind of stuff? Not yet, I don't think, but it does move the needle in terms of watching heaven come to earth, this whole kingdom value. So watching the lives of women and what they go through on a daily basis change as a result of being valued as human beings
Mm.
and being seen as image bearers, watching children, especially female children, and watching them be valued as image bearers and no
Yeah.
longer um, having to put up with what they have to put up with in some cultures. Watching people begin to reach out to their neighbors, even extremely poor people from a Western standpoint,
Yep.
watching them develop hearts of generosity with what little they have, and begin to reach out to neighbors and share and help feed their neighbors and help heal their neighbors and those kinds of things. Watching that happen, you begin to realize that something's happening from the inside out here
Yep.
with these people, because the culture they grew up in really drove them one way, but
Hmm.
the new culture, the new kingdom DNA that's being planted inside them
Yep.
is causing them to choose against themselves and live an other-centered life.
Yeah. And as we come to realize our own identity as beloved sons or daughters of the Father, that we can see others as the same, that they are also beloved and they are image bearers, right? You could see them
Oh
with
yeah,
the Father's eyes, and it
yeah,
does something totally different, that we could start to become more like Jesus and hang out with the prostitutes and the tax collectors and everybody else that Jesus hung out with,
oh
because
yeah, yeah,
we see them with new eyes and fresh eyes.
yeah. The concept of kingdom as a culture, and the idea of Jesus being the king. It's sometimes in the neighborhoods that you and I live in, because
Hmm.
we live here in Midwest and stuff. And you ask people, would you like your where you live to be less like hell and more like heaven? Um, and people look around and they see well-fed, really overfed
Yep.
people. The only complaints they have is they don't mow the yard, or this the level of comfort which we
Yeah.
live at is so high, that it's so hard for us in the West, to really see what it would look like. But when you get behind the curtain, or you look at it as a different filter, you look up and down these well manicured neighborhoods and houses, and you see a poverty in marriage.
Hmm.
We see now COVID is exposing, it didn't cause, but exposed a poverty of relationship.
Yep.
And we see that people have so few spaces, where they're known and explored and discovered,
Yeah.
and they're just living a life of isolation, and oftentimes, even in relationship to the people they live in, they're living in a house where there's duets, kind of lived out in monologues,
Mm.
because they don't even connect,
Yep.
and that kind of stuff. And so the poverty that exists and the need to bring kingdom values in that kind of poverty is necessary even in the West.
Yeah.
And sometimes those of us who've grown up in kind of traditional Christianity, which has a lot of flaws in it, it
Hmm.
causes us to become blind
Yeah.
to those kinds of poverties that exist in our culture.
Yeah. I think we probably have to have a redefinition of poverty. So
Mm-hmm.
what would you tell somebody that poverty is? And it's probably not monetary.
Yeah, I do think it goes back to your original thought about kingdom values. It's poverty is a lack of what's happening in heaven.
Hmm.
When Jesus prays or teaches us to pray, may it be on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah.
This idea of kingdom values, the life, the everlasting kingdom that those who are connected to Jesus will live in. Um, so those values, getting a
Mhm.
chance to be experienced on earth, in a
Yeah.
space where, I don't think there is um, a mental health issue in heaven.
Right.
Heaven is a place where I get known and
Yeah.
explored and discovered, and
Yeah.
I feel loved at a really deep level. Um,
Hmm.
and there's not a sense of isolation in heaven.
Yeah.
So when I look at that, I see poverty as a lack of those kingdom values, in our life right now. And unfortunately, especially for those of us in the West, poverty is usually related to money. I lack money,
Right.
so therefore I can't afford, water, health, sanitation, you know, food, those
Yep.
kinds of things. And it's so much more than that.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's really good. The lack of heaven on earth is a really good definition of poverty. I like that a
Mm-hmm.
lot.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
is there a good way for us to posture ourselves uh, to bring heaven to earth to those around us and to the community around us?
Well, I'm a real proponent of a disciple making movements mindset and lifestyle, to help people understand that um, the kind of Christianity that's been prosecuted in the West, is all really has its center of gravity on Sunday. It's focused on a building, usually
Mm-hmm.
focused on large gatherings. It's usually focused on gatherings where there's a very few people that use gifts, and most people are consumers,
Yep.
and there's only a few producers in that kind of thing. And it's moving the center of gravity of our Christianity from that Sunday to Sunday thing to a 24/7 space where we put our feet on the ground when we get out of bed in the morning.
Yeah.
It's where we spend our time, and that's where we see our core spirituality, being lived out. And it's there that those kingdom values can leak down and to bring, heaven to earth in that sense. And so I love, the use of Discovery Bible Study, helping people understand, that their job as a follower of Jesus, their first, foremost, and final job as a follower of Jesus is to make disciples. That was
Yep.
Jesus's last command to us. I can't imagine on that day when it's all over, you're coming to the finish line, and Jesus is there looking, and he's looking, and he's looking, and he's looking for you, but he's looking for the people you're bringing,
Yeah.
because he said make disciples, and you show up, by yourself, and it's like he's like, where is everybody? It's like I ask you to make disciples. I ask you to, teach people to, obey, to learn
Right.
obedience to everything I've commanded. That's all I ask, and we did this and that and that and that, but we didn't do the very basic thing that
Mm.
he said. So, we just teach people to learn to read the Bible for themselves, get their fingerprints in the Bible, and then invite their friends and neighbors and relatives into that process.
Yep.
And so, learning that process of being able to, as an ordinary, follower of Jesus, to hear from God and to do what he says
Yeah.
and share it with someone, is, to me, it's like the basic. I have these um, Lego blocks on my desk here to remind
Uh-huh.
me that I don't know if you've probably seen some of the Lego shows and stuff, and some of
Yeah.
the spaces around this world where people build, crazy things out of
Incredible
Legos,
things.
but they're just this simple pieces,
Yeah.
and
It's a
out of
small little
simple
block.
things,
Yeah.
yeah, big things can be built.
Yep.
And so, out of that simple process of hearing from God, doing what he says, and sharing it with other people, amazing kingdom values, can be built inside people.
Yeah, that's good. To take it back to the simple basics. What does it look like to follow Jesus? And then to reproduce it in others, to help others be disciples.
Mm-hmm.
Then, something that on the outside looks like it just looks beautiful, complex, different colors, but the building blocks are the exact same all the way throughout
Mm-hmm.
the whole process. And
Mm-hmm.
I love that analogy. I heard it said before that God likes fractal multiplication, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just like fractals, simple fractals
Mm-hmm.
that then
Mm-hmm.
flow out and get multiplied.
Yeah.
But I really like your analogy. It's really good and helpful. What's something as you're in this world of disciple making movements, you're seeing one of the things that was a shift in my mind. The first thing when I got really excited about disciple making movements, I was excited about the rapid multiplication aspect of it. Like
Hmm.
it can just flow easily. And my and I came to realize that to get rapid multiplication, it takes long-term walking with people, pointing them to Jesus on
Hmm.
the everyday, and it's a messy process when you're in the middle of it. So
Hmm.
how do you take people from, what's on the surface, what does it look like from the outside, to what does it really look like on the inside?
Well, one of the stories I like to tell is a lot of people get their start by reading the book Miraculous Movements,
Mm-hmm.
and
Or spent
Jerry
matches,
Trousdale's.
right? No.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe, but mostly Miraculous Movements. But uh, Jerry Trousdale's a dear friend, and I'm always teasing him about the fact that he really wrote part two.
Mm.
He didn't.
Yep.
He didn't write part one,
Mm-hmm.
and part one of that sub-Saharan story. And I have the privilege of working regularly and knowing all those guys, is messy. I mean, you started
Yeah.
at 2003, you go to about 2008, and it's just a windy path.
Yep.
It's convoluted. There's restarts. There's people that come in and go out, and it's just messy and
Yeah.
ugly, in some spots. And then because of the perseverance
Yep.
that takes place, and because there are a handful of guys who just said, we're going to see what God can do, and we're not going to take failure as anything other than a learning experience.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, the book starts in 2008 and begins to really show the whole story. But if you read the prequel to Miraculous
Mm-hmm.
Movements, a lot of Westerners wouldn't even get started,
Oh yeah.
because of what you just said.
Yeah.
It's just messy in that sense. And so I think of it in terms of just mindset shifts. For me, I came to I'm leading a successful church. We're seeing people come to faith. We're baptizing them.
Yeah.
All of the ways that we count success in the West. When I was involved, or I still am involved, Shoal Creek, were really good. But at the same time, I was looking at the county that I lived in here in Clay County, which is
Mm-hmm.
in Northeast Kansas City, and I could see that even with our success, we weren't moving the needle on lostness. My
Right.
county there were still more people dying and going to hell in my county um, after I started Shoal Creek than
Mm-hmm.
before I started Shoal Creek. Now, there are a lot of anecdotal stories, hundreds of people come to faith, and
Right.
that kind of stuff. But I had to realize that I really wanted to affect the county area. I wanted to see these 300,000 people that God had laid on our heart and stuff. So there was a real sense in which I had to change my mind about how things came,
Yep.
and that drove me to not looking for the latest DVD or book that was out
Right.
by the popular author, and stuff. I just started on a trek to see, where is true multiplication taking place?
Mm-hmm.
Where, if you read, or get involved in Silicon Valley in any way, form or fashion, the word scale is a big deal.
Right.
It's like,
Yep.
will this scale? Will this scale? I mean, will it not go from 1 to 2, but will it go from 1 to 100?
Mm-hmm.
Will it do 100 times, 1,000 times, or 10,000 times? And I just started asking the question. I said, the gospel should scale.
Yeah.
It should somehow scale. And so I just began a worldwide search. I started in the U.S., but ended up in the world to find a place like that. And then as I did, I discovered that those values drove me back to the text of Scripture,
Yep.
and drove me back to sort of a basic understanding that I failed to get, even though I have, I'm pretty educated as theological
Yeah.
terms go. I mean, I'm educated beyond my own intelligence. So it drove those values deep, in me, and such a way that instead of it being the newest fad or thing, I've been at this for almost 13 years now, in
Right.
a sense, and people say, well, aren't you going to give up? There aren't movements in the West yet, blah, blah, all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, I find myself finding it hard to give up because it's not a new fad or anything. It's what I see in the text of scripture.
Mm-hmm.
And that has rooted my mindset,
Yeah.
in biblical values.
Yeah.
And so I see the scriptures in a different way now. When I read, when Jesus heals the demoniac and he tries to get in the boat with Jesus, and Jesus says, no, go back to where you came from and tell him what I did. Well, my modus operandi before that was basically to say, okay, let's get this guy into a follow-up class. Let's get him,
Yeah.
through the 12 fundamentals, and let's see if we can train him to be a small group leader and get him equipped with the skills and mindsets that he needs,
Yeah.
and let's get him, maybe in 3 years into leadership.
Yeah.
And Jesus says, no, go now. And those kinds of moments, as I reread the scriptures, just turned me upside down.
Wow.
It's like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And I began to see a different way of understanding what Jesus was doing. And so now, even though I really cringe, the idea of DMM or disciple making movements and that kind of stuff gets thrown around so much, and people look at it like they can go buy it at a Christian bookstore if those existed anymore. But it really is a deep set biblical worldview that has set in me, and in such a way that I'm willing to live the rest of my life, whatever I've got left, trying to figure out how do I help people get this kind of kingdom value embedded, in their life, and stuff. So I'm not sure if I'm even answering your question here, Joshua.
I think that's good, but I also think if we're changing our mindset, we have to be humble enough to say we don't actually know everything. And there is something that we need to learn from scripture. I also think, you're saying, where is multiplication happening? We might have to go out and we might have to learn from our African brothers and sisters. And we have to sit under their teaching. And that's a humble thing for a Westerner to do. But I think it's important. What have you learned from your African brothers and sisters in this multiplication arena?
Well, one of the first things that they taught me was how to accept failure. Growing up as a Westerner, with a real ethnocentrism about myself. I mean, some people might call that racism, but I like to think of it as we're all ethnocentric. Right. We all have this. We start from ourselves. We are our own standard. Yep. We're what's normal, and everything else is abnormal. So, when you, as you know this, and traveling overseas, and especially in Africa, things there don't always work. So, the roads you travel on. We take a small spare in our car because we might have a flat, once a year, maybe. Well, they take 2 spares because they're going to have a flat for sure on this trip, and probably 2, and hopefully not 3, that kind of thing. And so their way of looking at the world is it doesn't work.
Yeah.
My way of looking at the world is it works. And so I realized that I had an entitlement piece. I come back to the Bible and I say, God says there's a God of this world, and he's not my God. He's a different God. And so this world doesn't work.
Wow.
And they were closer to the text of scripture than I was.
Yeah.
And I had to come back and realize is that some of my really basic filters in life are based off of sort of an Americanism, not a biblicalism, in that sense.
Wow.
And so they helped me, just learn patience and learn that when things don't work, you don't give up. You just keep moving.
Yeah.
And failure is just, we like to use, failure is the first step to success, and all those kind of things are great posters, and they're great, screensavers and all that kind of stuff, but we don't really believe them.
Right.
We don't
We
really
don't.
live by them, but they
Yeah.
live by them. It is a part of the texture of their life.
Yeah.
And I've watched, in fact, I just got off of, Zoom with one of the best movement leaders that I know. And I've watched a guy who's he's been to like 6 seminaries. He's got as much Western education as anybody I know, but he is the most catalytic leader in the sense that when he's in the room,
Yeah.
sometimes you don't know he's in the room.
Hmm.
He has the ability to raise up people
Wow.
and create leaders around him without sucking all the air in the room out.
Hmm.
And I was trained in a way that that taught me to be attractive.
Yeah.
I need to use my knowledge, my persuasive skills, my leadership, all of my abilities to attract people to me, to shine brightly so that they would follow me and have allegiance and loyalty to me. And I watched an African leader who had a radically polar opposite way of operating, who had more influence than I could ever imagine. And he was operating in the opposite direction I was. And so I learned, or I've begun learning that humility, of how to keep my mouth shut, how to ask questions rather than to give answers, how to back away and give people opportunity, rather than take initiative and have a bias for action and all those kinds of things that I always thought were really great leadership qualities. And so they just model those for me, and they're very patient about letting me see those things rather than pointing them out to me.
That's that's an amazing quality, is that patience towards you. And I think, letting you discover what you don't know, it's going to have more impact on you in the long term.
Yeah. It's funny how they have adapted Western things to explain that to me, in a sense. So the word catalyst is not necessarily, it's an English word, and it's not necessarily found that readily in other languages and stuff. But I've seen in movement world, it's been adopted in a big way. And so they pointed out to me that an epoxy has a catalyst and a hardener in it, and so kind of a glue base, and then this catalyst piece, and the catalyst piece disappears. When you squeeze it out of a tube and say there's 2 tubes, and it goes down, and you mix it together, the catalyst piece of it just disappears. And they pointed out to me that that's the kind of leadership we're looking for, is the kind of leadership that fades away, and it's like, oh, okay, I got it now. but that is polar opposite to anything and everything that I ever learned about leadership in a formal setting.
Yeah, it is. It is. So how does that work in I don't know, 3, 4, 5 generations down the line, when you have a catalytic leadership that disappears? What kind of leaders remain?
Well, I mean, that's the kind of leader that remains, I think. What happens is that your role ends up being coaching, rather than performing. And so from behind, you're able to work with people and help coach them rather than have them follow you in your performance or whatever you're doing. And so you model a little bit for them, and then you give them, opportunities, and then you coach them from the shadows. And so, my friend Harry Brown at New Generations is fond of always saying that you're not in the movement business, unless you can give it away. You can give the gospel away to the 3rd generation, and it happens at the same quality as when you're present. So, at that point, when your great grandchildren are having the kind of kingdom values that you started with, that you've been able to give it away, and it's been able to give it away again, and you've
Yeah.
got the kind of quality that will remain. And I think that is, at that point, you've got a leadership, and you've also modeled that coaching. A
Yep.
lot of people think in terms of the movement world, they think it's just like a match thrown into a forest fire and it just burns it down. And
Yeah.
the fact is that every one of the movements that Justin Long is tracking at 2414,
Yep.
it has a deep coaching element to it.
Yeah. It
I
does.
know you know that, and you guys at All Nations are, you know, invested in that. All of us in movements are invested in this idea of having, a long-term coaching relation. In fact,
Yeah.
someone asked yesterday at the DMM Global Catalyst Camp, when do you stop coaching? And it's like, the answer was, when you stop breathing.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that coaching is, I mean, that's a different mindset too. When Meredith and I went out to the Middle East, when we first went to find open and hungry people for the gospel, we found Muslims that were open to Jesus. We gathered more people in a room and modeled a discovery Bible study with them, and we very quickly tried to extract ourselves out, but it never worked, not once. The only time it worked is when we changed strategies. We found open and hungry people for the gospel. These Muslims said, yes, I want to follow Jesus. And so we did it individually with them, or their immediate family, and modeled a discovery Bible study and said, okay, now you take this and go do this with your friends and your family and your neighbors and everybody around you. And then we had a behind the scenes coaching relationship, and things started to multiply. They started to step into leadership instead of relying on us to say, hey, you're the spiritual, teacher here, you teach. It was totally transformative for us. And we started to see, second, third, fourth generations happen because we took the back seat from the very beginning. We never took a front seat, not even once. And that was the one thing that really helped us out.
Yeah. That's, again, that was the sort of revolution in my own mind of being hit with that. And you read like Acts 19, Paul
Mm-hmm.
is in Ephesus, and he had some trouble, in the synagogue. And so he stopped sort of public type ministry type stuff. And he moves down the street, to a hall, a basic rents a space, and starts discussing with the disciples. And then quickly Luke says, and as a result of that, the entire Asia Minor heard the word of the Lord. And it's like, well,
Yeah.
it didn't say he went on, crusades or led a bunch of this and that kind of stuff. But obviously there's multiplication taking place there, because the discussions he's having with the disciples somehow reaches out, all to Asia Minor. And so that idea of you and I not being the binding agent,
Yep.
in these things. And that's what happens with so many people, and especially so many people in the US who are, thinking they're using a disciple making movement strategy. And they're doing, discovery groups with, immigrant populations, and they're in the middle of it, facilitating these discovery groups. And, it's hard to tell them that it's selfish, but the reality is, it's really selfish, because you just want to be where the action is. And the reality is, if you want the gospel to multiply, then you got to get out of that room. You've got to somehow facilitate someone else being there. That's an insider, and you're definitely not an insider, in that regard.
Yeah, that's so good. And it's so needed, especially here in the West, as we're trying to go out and see gospel saturation happen throughout, the United States. How do we get out of the way? Then give everybody the tools that they need to discover Jesus within their own community, and that could then multiply. That's so good.
Yeah. Yeah.
As you've been in this disciple making movement world, I mean, you're pretty steeped into it. Since you had those mind shifts, how has your personal relationship with Jesus transformed and changed since this has happened?
So I used to be a professional Christian,
Yeah.
um, because I'm on the staff of a church. I started a church. I'm, on boards of Christian organizations and that kind of stuff. And one of the beauties about this whole process, it's driven me back to get my fingerprints on the Bible
Mm-hmm.
in a way that is not for something.
Mm. Yeah.
So it's usually for
Right.
I'm speaking on Sunday morning.
Exactly.
I've got to do this. It's not for something. It's for me,
Mm.
and to be able to. So the very first thing that happened in this whole process is it affected my spiritual disciplines because uh, I learned the value of solitude
Mm.
right off the bat. As I began to realize, it's like, okay, it's really not about giving answers; it's about asking questions here. And I don't know how that connected really to me, but I've
Mm.
always been a person who likes a lot of noise, drives my wife crazy. I'll come in and I'll turn music on, and I'll
Yeah.
have, I can have the TV, I can have music going on. I'd be working on my computer at the same time. I got this chaos going on, and it's a little bit like a drug for me. I'm a little bit ADHD. And so I need a
Mm-hmm.
lot of Ritalin like stuff going on in my brain so I can
Yeah.
focus. And so I didn't allow a lot of space for God to have the agenda.
Hmm.
And so that solitude and this idea of being far more passive in my leadership,
Yeah.
and far more indirect in my leadership, maybe
Yeah.
not passive, but indirect,
Yeah.
and learning to not act quickly, but to
Mm-hmm.
set back and leave room for other people to act. All of those kinds of things began to drive me to realize that I just started discovering the value of solitude
Mm.
and spending 30 minutes alone and just having a mantra. I'm not a new age guy type thing, but just a mantra that says to God, your agenda, not mine.
Mm. Yeah. That's good.
Your agenda, not mine. Because my mind's full of things.
Yep.
I got
Oh yeah.
things popping. I can pull up my phone and put down a couple of notes here and there and all this kind of stuff. It's like, no, Father, your agenda, not mine. I have to keep reminding myself of that.
Mm.
And it really just sort of took me down a notch. Maybe sometimes I could appear like I'm on, my third espresso, double shot, and it took me down a notch to say, wow, there's a calmness that can be here. And
Mm.
there's a real beauty to that sense of calmness, that space where you meet
Mm.
Jesus, and there doesn't have to be a lot of activity, a lot of things. And it was in those spaces that I began to experience being the beloved,
Yeah.
being that child of God, and realizing that, man, I there's no trophies that I have to take out of this world.
Mm.
You know,
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
that old song says, all my trophies I lay down. I think, okay, I don't have any trophies
Mm.
here. All I have is the fact that my Father decided to count me with the most infinite value of anything that exists in all the universe. Jesus died for me.
Yeah.
And that value, that price tag he put on me was of such great value that that's all I need.
Hmm.
And so, it
So
brought me
good.
back to that.
Yeah.
I spent a life pursuing books. I spent, life pursuing degrees, and, I
Yeah.
have a degree in Greek and studied Hebrew and Aramaic and all that kind of stuff, and a lot of that's good stuff, but I was doing it for the wrong reasons.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
it just took me back to some really simple things that,
Mm.
that I'm just a child of God. And that's what I want to take out of this world.
Yeah, that's so good. Did that practice of solitude that get you back into a little quieter space affect the relationships around you?
Yeah, it did. It caused me to be more curious.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, um, this whole idea of not being a teller, but being an asker, and letting other people discover things helped me learn to love people better,
Mm-hmm.
because I began to get curious, I have a love affair with curiosity now.
Yeah.
So I collect questions. I love to ask questions and help people learn to ask questions, because I look around. Earlier we were talking about our sort of mental health deficit in our
Yep.
world, and people just don't know how to lean into one another and explore each other.
Yeah.
It's just we get the surface stuff down, and then we get to a space where maybe we find that we don't see eye to eye politically, or we don't see eye to eye about some, the
Yep.
whatever, and we just sort of stay there, and we just
Right.
operate there, rather than continuing this exploration to get into who is Joshua, what makes him tick,
Yeah.
and why does he think that way, and that kind of stuff. So it helped me just be curious about
Hmm.
people, and I've discovered that people feel loved when you're curious about them,
This is very true.
uh, and it's just like, wow, who would have known,
Yeah.
that if you ask more questions and give more answers, people feel loved.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
How many direct answers did Jesus give when he was asked questions? Uh, Not very many.
Yeah. Not very many at all. Yeah.
Not very many.
Yeah. They ask
Are
over 300 questions, I think, something like that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So are there any tips or strategies that you use to ask good questions to people?
well, to me, it's like riding a bike. A lot of people think, well, that's a great idea, I'd like to ask some questions. And so they maybe leave, and, or that conversation, oh, I'm just going to ask some questions, and they never really do it. So I have this little piece of in some of the training that we do in the habits of a multiplying disciple,
Hmm.
where we talk about engaging lost people. And it's like, okay, here's a tool. And this tool
Yep.
is, I want you to develop 5 questions. So I have this PDF that has 400 questions at the current moment. I keep
Mm.
adding to it. So
Wow.
I collect blogs and people who are big into curiosity and questions. And so I just keep adding to it as I go through here, and find 5 that fit you,
Yeah.
so not every question, you can't, not everybody can ask every question, I
Right.
mean, it's just, you got to find something that fits, so take it into the dressing room, put it on, and see if it fits. So take 5 questions and take 4 weeks. Ask, make 1 Monday, 2 Tuesday, 3 Wednesday, Monday through Friday, and get the habit of asking that question every Monday.
Wow.
So just
Yeah.
one of those every Monday, just ask. That's
Yeah.
all I want you to do. Ask it, see what happens. Just see what happens. Next day, ask a different question, see what happens,
Yeah.
and at the end of that 4 weeks, come back and look at those 5 questions and say, okay, which ones didn't fit?
Yeah.
And there's, 395 more to choose from, or there's there's this thing called the internet that you can go out and find all kinds of things on,
Yeah.
find a replacement, and keep that habit up. Just, every day, just ask a question.
Hmm.
And people, they discover at some point how easy it is to get into spiritual conversations with people,
Yeah. It is.
by asking questions.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's not like you're trying to tell them about Jesus, but, I got into a conversation with a restaurant owner that I frequent on a regular basis, about global warming, by
Mhm.
asking a question.
Yeah.
And I was able to say to him, I said, my, my views of the earth don't really come from my politics. They come from Genesis 1,
Mhm.
where God is the creator of this universe and gifted me the stewardship of it.
Yeah.
And so I feel like, I'd ask him about packaging. I sit in this restaurant many mornings during the week, and the loader, the people who bring all the stuff in, are there at that time bringing the
Uh-huh.
stuff in. And I asked him if I said, do you ever get feel guilty or about all the packaging? All the stuff that comes in here is packaged in cardboard and plastic cartons. And then I watch them carry the waste out, and I said,
Yeah.
you ever that discomfort you? And he goes, yeah, it does. And so we got into this big, and he's, in the global warming and all this kind of stuff,
Yeah.
and on and on. And it's like, I don't know about that, but I just know that I believe that God created the universe, and
Yep.
and he gave me stewardship. It says it right there in Genesis 1. and stuff. And so, you have those opportunities to
Yeah.
really just, identify yourself obviously as a follower of Jesus, when you're asking questions like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that Meredith and I use a lot is one of your quotes that you like is to be spiritually obvious and not spiritually obnoxious.
Mm-hmm.
We got that from directly from you, so thank you for
Mm,
that. But being obvious, it draws people out, and
yeah.
asking, just being curious draws people out, and everybody has a spiritual ache. They're longing for something spiritually, and it's going
Yeah.
to come out when you're curious, and it's going to come
Yeah.
out when you're obvious. We
Oh
don't
yeah.
have to shove Jesus down people's throats,
No. No.
and it, it's so. And we don't have to just fake like, hey, I really like you, and never talk about Jesus. Uh, you
Yeah.
just can be with people naturally and curious, and people can
Yeah.
say, hey, I have this ache, and they start to walk towards God. um,
Yeah.
and so thank you for
Yeah.
showing us that we can be obvious, and it draws people out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so full disclosure here, I got that from David Watson.
All
So at
right.
some point, I don't know where he wrote it or
I'm
whatever,
sure
but
David Watson got it from
yeah,
somebody else.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he had a profound influence in my life. So a lot of things I say come from him. So
Oh, that's good. I like it. I just want one or two ways that we can make, besides you talked about asking questions, changing our mindsets. Are there any other ways that we can make Jesus more accessible to the people around us?
I think a person's story, is so valuable.
Yeah.
And this is back to listening and asking questions and stuff. So, to know, Joshua and Meredith and not know about, your time in the Middle East
Mm-hmm.
would be like to not know you,
Right.
I mean, and so, um, I think, the idea of seeing people, there's a movie I love. Um, and, I'm not recommending the movie for I don't want to get anybody, angry because I recommended a movie that they felt like had some stuff in it that they didn't like. But anyway, so it's called Grand Canyon, and
Uh-huh.
it's about a white guy who's really rich and a black guy who's sort of blue collar, and they meet. And on a couple of different occasions because of a car issue. One guy drives a wrecker and one guy has a Lexus or Mercedes or something. And so they become friends, and they end up at the Grand Canyon, and the whole
Mm.
story is about this Grand Canyon. And the kind of the idea is that everyone, um, I don't know anybody that's ever been to the Grand Canyon that doesn't have this sense of awe,
Oh,
this
yeah.
sense of, it's like, oh, look at this magnificent hole in the earth, this
Incredible.
crevice
Yeah.
that's just, yeah. And the metaphor in the movie is that every person you meet is like that.
Hmm.
They
Wow.
don't connect it to God, but we can,
Yeah.
we're creating His image. We're image
Yep.
bearers. We're about imaging Him, and so I think of when I connect with people, I long to know their story.
Yeah.
I'm going to a club I belong to tonight. It's a, a club of men that will meet, and we'll sit around, and I'll pick out a guy, and I'll just say I want to know his story.
Hmm.
And so I will begin to lean into him, and invariably, in that relationship, it will allow me to make Jesus accessible to him,
Yeah.
because there will be some reciprocity at some time. He
Yep.
will ask a few things about me, or we'll have an exchange that will take us deeper.
Yep.
And so I think, viewing people as a story,
Hmm.
not rather than just a set of actions.
Yep.
That guy cut me off in traffic. Well, what's the story here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
What's the
that's good.
story behind this person? I think that's really, really important. And the thought that drives me, is really an answer to the question, what does God want?
Yeah.
And when you look at the Bible, you really can see that God wants a family.
Hmm.
The triune God could have existed for eternity upon eternities, and there's oneness, there's fulfillment, there's purity, there's holiness, everything's complete there.
Yeah.
There's nothing needed in the triune God,
Yep.
but they wanted a family to experience the relationship that they had, and so they created humanity. And so the Bible is a story about God attempting to build that family. And so, you look from Genesis all the way down through Revelation, God is one of family. So when I get in the family, then my main activity is to find those family members that aren't yet connected to the family.
Yeah.
So
That's good.
When I realize that God's looking for his not yet children,
Mm-hmm.
And I look around my neighborhoods, I look out my window right now, or I get in my car and go to the grocery store. I'm constantly sort of thinking, okay, Father, help me find your children that are not yet
Wow.
connected to you. And realizing that he's out there doing that, and I just need to find him in that process.
Yeah. That's so
It just
good.
helps me make Jesus more accessible to people.
Yeah, that's
So,
so good. Yeah, there's just a couple of questions I like to ask at the end. One is, if you can give advice to your 21-year-old self, what would you say to your 21-year-old self?
well, this is a no brainer, but I wish I would have found more wise people to ask questions of.
Hmm.
I was so interested in displaying the knowledge that I had acquired
Yeah.
that I probably missed so many opportunities to listen to people around me that had so much more experience than
Hmm.
me, and just to let them talk.
Yeah.
I knew a little bit of it in my life. My father was in the Air Force, so I grew up as a military dependent.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember several stations we had where people lived together in the same neighborhoods, and they would gather out on carports in lawn chairs. And as kids, you could be out playing, or you could sit there and listen to these military folks tell
Mm-hmm.
stories. And I
Yeah.
used to love listening to them tell stories. And somehow I lost that, as I gained a little bit of my own knowledge.
Mm,
So that was something I wish I'd have done.
good. Yeah, and are you reading or watching anything that you would recommend?
I am reading right now Eric Hoffer's The True Believer. It's about mass movements, and he was a longshoreman, a philosopher back in the 60s.
Hmm.
So yeah, that was really, really good. The other one I've just finished, and it's called Turn That Ship Around.
Uh-huh.
For anyone that likes to read a really fast storybook, it's about a Navy submarine captain.
Hmm.
And this is one of the best movement leadership books that I've ever seen.
Wow.
Because he has in the Navy, their routine is to give a captain a year to learn all the systems on a vessel and to become the subject matter expert of every system on the vessel.
Wow.
So you can answer every question, make every decision that needs to be made.
Yeah.
And this guy was given a boat, but then because of some emerging things, got switched and didn't get his year. He only got 6 weeks, and he was given the worst submarine in the Navy to command. And that process changes his entire way of leading, from having answers to asking questions.
Wow.
And it's a fascinating read as you go through that. And he tells the stories of how he came up with stuff and developed ways of helping people under him lead better.
Yeah.
And so it's called Turn That Ship Around.
Wow. Turn that ship around. All right. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah.
Roy,
Yeah.
thank you so much. It was a pleasure. It was great talking to you. I really enjoyed it. So
Oh man, thanks, man. I'm so glad you're doing this, man. I've got you on my list now, so
All
I'm
right.
looking forward to your future guests.
Thank you so much. All right. Have a good one.
All right, man. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to the show today. If you're really enjoying the show, please don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app. You could do it right now. Just hit that little plus. And then I would love it if you would leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. So you could go right now to the show and leave a star rating and review and let us know how you are enjoying the show. And find us on Facebook and Instagram. So if you want to connect, interact, I post a lot of quotes and different things that you could actually interact with the episodes and let me know how you are enjoying the show. If you feel inclined to donate, there is a support the show link in the show notes, and it would send you directly to a page where you could donate so that new episodes can be produced for your enjoyment. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have an incredible week.